A warm welcome to everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar on Article 6.2, which allows countries to exchange mitigation outcomes through bilateral agreements. Thank you also to EDF for hosting this panel discussion. This was originally a closed-door briefing, and the discussion was so good, we wanted to make it broadly available to a wider audience. So please enjoy this webinar, and we'll look forward to the discussion. As you all know, there's a lot of movement in this sector right now, particularly coming out of the negotiations in Dubai, and we're really excited to pull together just an incredible lineup of experts to talk today about the significance of what's happening with Article 6 and Article 6.2 in particular. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexia Kelley. I'm the Managing Director of the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative at the High Tide Foundation. We're a family office philanthropy focused exclusively on the climate crisis. And for me, I'm particularly excited to be hosting today's session because in a former life, I was the Article 6 negotiator for the US State Department, Copenhagen through Paris, and we're joined here today by other experts who've been deeply involved in the negotiations for many years, including Pedro Barata, who is now Senior VP or Associate Vice President for Carbon Markets and Private Sector Decarbonization at EDF. We also have Lisa DeMarco, who's a Senior Partner and CEO of Resilient LLP and former Chair of the International Emissions Trading Association, and probably one of the oldest and most experienced folks working in the legal aspects of carbon markets. By oldest, I mean, of course, longest running, not oldest. We're also joined by Lina Barrera, who's a Senior Vice President of Global Policy and Government Affairs at Conservation International, and Kelley Hamrick, who's a Senior Policy Advisor for International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy. And last but most assuredly not least, we're also joined by Sandeep Choudhury today, who's a Director of V&V Advisory Services, which is doing some of the best work on the ground community engagement and project development in the world. So we have just a depth and breadth of knowledge that is really unparalleled here today. And we're looking forward to a discussion with you on Article 6.2. So as you know, Article 6.2 is decentralized and is in the midst of being operationalized and implemented in a variety of contexts. Countries are moving forward with programs, and so now is a really important moment to explore these issues more broadly and to discuss how this mechanism can best be designed to ensure that it delivers for both climate and people. So they're going to be providing a range of insights into what you can expect to see from Article 6.2 deals today, and would like to thank them in particular for giving up their time in an extremely busy period. So we'll ask each panelist to provide some opening views, and then we'll dig into a discussion. So let's go ahead and get going. First, I'd like to welcome Lina. Lina's work focuses on providing science-based policy recommendations to ensure that nature is built into public policies and funding priorities at Conservation International. Lina, could you give us a little bit of an overview of Article 6.2 and what guardrails today exist in the current framework?
Sure. Thanks, Alexia. So Article 6.2 was designed for country-to-country carbon trading, right, where the buyer and the seller countries have flexibility to come to an agreement on the specifics of their transaction. So things like the price, the volume, the type of credit, the year of, that the credit was generated, so long as it's after post-2020, and any kind of requirements for verification or reporting and other details, that's up to the buyers and the buyer and the seller countries. And the reason for that is that the intention was to allow countries to trade in order to help them meet their climate commitments as quickly as possible and as cost effectively as possible, so that basically more action would be possible at a similar cost. So we would have more ambition and we would have fast action, which we all recognize we need. But at the same time, the idea was to set parameters that all trades have to meet in order to ensure high environmental integrity and social integrity. So to do that, countries basically establish some parameters for Article 6.2, and those fall into four main categories. Well, three really. The first is avoiding harm. So there's a requirement to avoid environmental, economic, or social harm. The second is around rights and the importance of respecting and promoting human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And the third is around integrity and ambition. So under that, countries have to do corresponding adjustments to make sure we're not double counting any of the climate results that we're getting. There have to be conservative baselines so that we're ensuring ambitious results. There have to be additionality and systems to address risks of reversals. And there has to be an insurance, we have to assure that trading doesn't lead to an increase in net emissions, right? Because nobody wants that. So but I've just summarized that in a very succinct manner, but that covers, there are a lot of details under that, and it covers a lot of, many, many pages dedicated to these elements. But those are the basic guardrails, right? They cover quite a bit of ground, and they basically create this high-level guidance for countries to adhere to that pushes them towards high integrity, but also gives them some freedom to determine the details of their transactions with other countries.
Thanks so much, Lina. Pedro, I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about your views on 6.2 as one of the architects of the Article 6 provisions. What can demand and supply side governments do to ensure that what's often characterized as a more bottom-up approach to market-based mechanisms and their development under the Paris Agreement? What can we do to ensure the integrity of these programs overall as they continue to emerge and take form?
So thank you for the question. Pleasure to be here. So the first thing, and just building on what Lina said and your introduction, is to note that the fundamental distinction of Article 6.2 from the previous frameworks and other frameworks that we've had for international cooperation in carbon markets. And the fundamental difference is that this time, the stress is on flexibility, a little bit like the overall framework of Paris is quite more flexible than the very constraining nature of targets and timetables under the Kyoto Protocol. That reflects itself in the carbon market space. And so Article 6.2 is just a reflection of that. It's a different space, and the stress is on flexibility. And with that flexibility, hopefully coming innovation, et cetera, which means that now, in this new world, we have a lot more roles for governments, both on the buy side and the sell side, to take on. So to give you a few examples, so on the let's say called the presumed buy side, because in actual fact, we will never be able to anticipate what is the buy and sell side. But in the presumed buy side, the governments that are planning on buying, the first thing that they have to do is, well, first of all, put together strong rules and strong programs in terms of procurement of carbon credits. Those of us who were involved in the Kyoto Protocol days, they will know what that means, and there have been many government procurement funds. At the same time, if the stress is on inviting the private sector to play within this Article 6.2, then clearly we need governments to be clear about what role they expect the private sector to work in. And those include rules around claims and use purposes, disclosure of carbon credit. So what are companies going to be needing to disclose related to their purchase of carbon credits? And also, to the extent that this is an issue, looking at clarifying the accounting. So what Lina just mentioned now, the corresponding adjustment nature. So the accounting treatment under those national rules. That's the buy side. On the sell side, we're going to see actually a lot more, let's say, difference from the Kyoto Protocol days. In the Kyoto Protocol days, the expectation for any government, let's say in the global south that was involved in the clean development mechanism, was really you only had to provide assurance through a letter of approval that you approved that particular project activity, which could be a very streamlined operation. But in the new Paris Agreement framework, countries have, first of all, to do their homework in understanding that there is now an opportunity cost to engaging in the international carbon market. And so every time that you're selling abroad, you may or may not be looking to have a corresponding adjustment to your NDC. That carries a cost. And that opportunity cost is important. And it's critical, I think, that South governments, let's call them global South governments, take on that homework of considering how and when to engage in international voluntary carbon markets. The second thing that I think governments would be well advised to do is to educate themselves on rules on integrity. So obviously following exactly what Lina has mentioned already, but I would also do a plug here, an unashamed plug to the rules that the voluntary government market has itself put together. So looking for the VCMI and the ICVCM in terms of here's the inspiration for what can be a very strong framework for ensuring integrity for your carbon credits, the ones that you're thinking of supplying to the international market. And finally, I think it's really important that global South governments, or presumed seller governments, put it this way, provide a coherent framework for the engagement of the private sector. And that includes a lot of rules that in the past we have not asked governments to think about. But for example, how do you do tax treatment of these particular assets? How do you plan on having disclosure? How do you plan on having stakeholder engagement? And the good thing is on both the buy side and the sell side, we're already seeing emerging good practice along many of these things. So for example, we are seeing government procurement funds starting to be very active in Article 6.2 from some European countries. We're also seeing some relatively good and early mover frameworks at national level being developed in places like Kenya, for example, or Ghana. And again, a plug for those countries that do not have yet those frameworks. There is substantial support that can be provided through things like the VCMI country access strategy. So basically, yes, the panorama has changed a lot, and Article 6.2 is very different from what we were used to. But I think we're up to the challenge, and governments will be up to the challenge.
Thanks, Pedro. And I think this point you make about just the new sort of complexity and the engagement landscape for developing countries in particular, and how different that is than it used to be, is a really important one, because developing countries in particular are faced with a much wider range of ways in which they can engage in the market. And there are a lot more sort of complicated trade-offs at play that I think is going to be important to unpack a little bit later. Kelley, on that kind of set of questions, and maybe further unpacking just some of the relationships and the differences between Article 6.2 and 6.4, how do you see that really playing out over the next little bit? And what are your views on the right direction there?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alexia, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I wanted to maybe start at the high level. Lina kind of talked about this, but both Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 serve the same purpose. And that's really to allow countries to trade with each other to more efficiently meet their climate contributions and to raise global ambitions. So they're two sides of the same coin. Where they differ is in the approach. And so I've tried to come up with an analogy that I hope I won't take too far here. But let's say that you invite a bunch of friends over for game night. If you play Scrabble, you're going to have a standard set of rules. Even if you play on a different night, if you play with a different group of friends, that's basically Article 6.4. It's very similar. There's going to be a supervisory body. They're going to create the rules, and they're going to create the methodologies for 6.4. And all countries need to do is just show up and play. On the other hand, maybe you and your friends, you're kind of looking at all the games. You're like, maybe Monopoly, maybe we'll do Scrabble. Maybe you decide on something like Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but it's a game where it has more kind of suggestions than rules. And it's kind of developed with the input of the players as you play. So Article 6.2 is like this. There is so much opportunity for countries at the table to really kind of define their own strategies and rules and methodologies. But I think the really important piece here, which Lina mentioned a bit as well, was that these have to be rules and methodologies that everybody at the table agrees with. So you can't just have kind of one person self-define. So I'm gonna drop the analogy now. But so because Article 6.4 is a more centralized approach, basically that means there's a lot of more upfront work that needs to be done in defining the rules. And so that's why we're not seeing as much Article 6.4 activity right now. But I do think once those rules are set up and defined and in place, it will be able to really quickly scale. And so countries, as Pedro was saying, there's a lot a lot of decisions you might have to make around 6.2. So countries without as much, in-house expertise or capacity, they might really prefer to use this Article 6.4 route. And in contrast, Article 6.2, because it really encourages innovation and creativity, we're seeing tons of pilots right now. And I think that's a really good thing. So countries are trying to scope out, what and how and when they want to engage with 6.2. And we're not actually seeing a whole lot of actual trades. We're just seeing these pilots because a lot of these are still kind of very early stage decisions that countries are trying to think through. And some of what we're seeing is countries on the demand side, like Singapore, are looking at off-the-shelf methodologies. So they're basically saying, okay, look, we're going to approve existing methodologies under existing voluntary carbon market standards like Verra or the gold standard or ART-TREES. Whereas other countries that are kind of on the demand side, like Japan, are basically tailor-making methodologies for each country partnership they have. So there's a whole range of approaches of kind of what we're seeing. And I think the name of the game is really flexibility here. And I guess maybe just one final thought of kind of how the two compare. I do think we could see some Article 6.2 approaches recognize or use approaches that will be approved under Article 6.4, just like Singapore is kind of recognizing, existing VCM methodologies. But I guess the main point I want to get across here is that's just one option. It's not the only option that 6.2 countries will have for trading. So there's a lot of potential overlap for lessons learned, but at the end of the day, these will be distinct approaches.
Yeah, thanks, Kelley. Great. So 6.4 Scrabble, 6.2 Dungeons and Dragons. I think it is helpful to kind of understand the difference in the architecture and the design of the two different mechanisms, because they really sort of were intended to serve similar but distinct purposes. And obviously there's going to be a lot at play as countries work out which parts of the market they want to be engaging in, when and how. Lisa, turning to you now, you were, I know, in Dubai and in the negotiating rooms until the wee hours, as things started to unravel, in the 6.4 and 6.2 negotiations. Do you think that the kind of progress on 6.2 agreements were negatively impacted by the outcome at COP28? And how do you see 6.2 fitting in relation to other rapidly emerging carbon market and compliance mechanisms around the globe?
Thanks very much, Alexia. Yeah, it would have been lovely to have the certainty of the form of the actual documents and records that you have to submit for Article 6.2, particularly that agreed electronic format that we've been using in draft for a while, could have been finalized quite easily, but the politics were rather right. But no, in fact, the data shows that Article 6.2 was not at all negatively affected by the outcome of the negotiations. And I'm going to give you some numbers. We have 13 new bilateral agreements since the COP, 1 new buyer in the form of Norway, 4 new host countries, developing countries that really need the capital to affect the energy transition, 2 new pilot projects, 1 new authorization statement, and on the 15th of December, just after the COP, we had our first issuance of ITMOs, 1,916 ITMOs. So it looks as though Article 6.2 is filling the gap while we are waiting for the associated rules to come forward on Article 6.4. And it really is that innovation mechanism that is a compliance mechanism under the Paris Agreement that allows for that good accounting, good record keeping, no double counting, and associated way to mobilize the money we need to get into energy transition. And just to answer the second part of your question, the money we need to put into the energy transition isn't insignificant, right? The IEA estimates that it's $4 trillion a year that is required to reach net zero by 2020 in accordance with the Paris goals. So we have to get that money mobilized, and we have to do it in coordination with the private sector and countries that really need to significantly transition. So it is a critical arrow in the quiver of tools. It's not the only tool, but it is a critical tool in that quiver of tools that we have to address the goals of the Paris Agreement, and really in this key decade prior to 2030, mobilize the changes, fund the changes that we need in the intervening period. I can't see how we do so in a manner that's affordable and particularly does not negatively impact the most vulnerable people without a market mechanism like 6.2 in place.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lisa. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym SOUP of the UNFCCC, ITMO stands for Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcome. So that's the credit that'll be traded among countries as part of their nationally determined contribution compliance demonstration. So on that last important point that you made, Lisa, just around finance mobilization in particular for the Global South, I'd like to ask Sandeep to offer some views on, what are you seeing from kind of Global South government perspectives? And it would actually be great to provide a couple of examples of Article 6.2 projects that you might be seeing on the ground to give folks a flavor of, what does this cooperation look like on the ground, and how are we seeing this market evolve from the perspective of the folks on the ground?
Thanks, Alexia, and thanks for having me here. I think the most important part, I think, for a lot of the governments that we work with is firstly trying to wrap their heads around this, and in a way, and I think this Article 6, whether it's 6.2 or 6.4, is extremely important for the Paris Agreement. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of the governments that we work with are scratching their heads on BURs and stock takes and so on and so forth. This actually allows institutional mechanisms to be set up for better accounting practices. That's something Pedro alluded to, Lisa alluded to as well, which I think is very, very important. Suddenly, you will have to do your homework. I mean, how am I going to meet my NDCs? Because there was a high-level document back in 2015, great. I mean, 2017, 18, whenever. But a lot of bureaucrats, and the reality in the Global South is bureaucrats churn. They're not there forever. So this knowledge transfer does not happen very well. So, what happens is we have to institutionalize this knowledge. And for that, I think Article 6 plays an excellent role, because once you're starting to work with 6.2, you would have to understand your pathway to your NDCs, accounting systems, as well as your inventories and how you're going to meet your NDCs. So it actually is extremely important for countries to meet their Paris Agreement from the Global South, especially. So that is something that I think that understanding is going down and trickling down slowly. And I think it's kind of picking up a lot of traction after Glasgow, and then Sharm, and then what we had in Dubai as well. So firstly, I think a lot of governments and a lot of decision makers within governments, which is above the Ministry of Environment and so on and so forth, think of this as an institutional buildup, which is great. I think that's a good way to look at it. And secondly, they also look at a lot of them, especially the ones with conditional NDCs, are looking at NDC pathways. So great, I want to reduce my emissions, but how? What are the mitigation costs? What are the technology costs? So I think 6.2 will help a lot within North-South technology transfer as well as knowledge transfer, because you can harp on all the NDCs you want. A lot of governments are floundering on how to meet those NDCs. So we have to show the pathway, and I think 6.2 helps a lot in setting that up. So different kinds of technologies. I mean, you talk about, you ask for examples. I mean, we're working on pilots as well. We're working on pilots on waste management for countries which have never processed their waste ever in their lives. Maybe part of the NDC, maybe not part of the NDC. And that's where I look at ambition raising as well. And then you look at electric vehicle fleets of two-wheelers. I come from Asia. We have a huge fleet of two-wheelers. You name countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, these are huge. So how do I subsidize this on a G2G basis? And there is the recognition going on that public climate finance, except debt finance, hasn't really filled the gap so far. So Green Climate Fund and all of the other adaptation funds and so on and so forth, that can only provide you that much. Countries to meet their NDCs need a lot more. Lisa mentioned trillions, right? So we're talking about at least billions. And that's not going to come from public climate finance. So where else do you look for? And that's where I think A, technology transfer, B, mitigation cost discovery. It helps with your strategy. A lot of governments are like, how do I get the CapEx to do this project, which is a 20-year mitigation? So maybe I can do a corresponding adjustment for 10 years for the investor to make their money back. And the next 10 years, I can claim under my NDC. So it helps strategize, periodic NDC meeting. A lot of different things are opening up. So in my opinion, and these are almost 15 governments that we kind of engage with, I think this recognition is coming through very quickly, saying, guys, we can use Article 6 extremely strategically to discover for our private sector, what is our mitigation pathway? How are we going to meet our NDCs? So that's a very important part of Article 6 that's lost in translation at some point. This is not about just global North governments using credits to meet their NDC. That's one part of the story. How are you enabling the global South to meet their NDC should be the biggest story here. So I'll stop on that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sandeep. Such important insights. And just one additional explainer. So conditional NDCs, if you haven't heard that term before, many developing countries, when they were submitting their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, said, we are going to commit to mitigating a certain portion of our emissions. Those targets are determined by the countries, the coverage of those targets, what's covered under them, how they'll be operationalized. And the timeline is really the only thing that was prescribed, but even that was flexible for countries. And so a lot of developing countries who historically hadn't had emission reduction obligations under the Kyoto Protocol stepped up and said, okay, we want to contribute to this problem. We didn't necessarily cause it, but we see that, all emissions matter and we want to do something about them. But many of them said, but we can't afford to pay for all of this work ourselves. And so they submitted what are called conditional NDCs, which are predicated on provision of international climate finance to help them deliver that portion of their target or their overall NDC the contribution that they had determined they would make. So you'll see in the NDC documentation some differentiation there, and the points that Sandeep are raising just about the importance of these mechanisms for accelerating finance flows more quickly and efficiently than historically we see climate finance moving, I think is actually a really, really important one. And when I was working as a buyer, certainly something that stood out to me as a real win for this market is that it does a great job of moving money to frontline communities more quickly and efficiently than just about any other international assistance mechanism that I ever saw working at the US government and across, a wide range of bilateral development assistance programs that are run through multilateral development institutions. So thanks for raising that important set of points, Sandeep. And thanks to all the panelists for your super insightful and interesting comments. Thank you so much for joining us. This concludes today's webinar on Article 6.2 programs, where our brilliant panelists discussed what high integrity is and why it matters under emerging international agreements. I hope everyone found the webinar as informative as I did and thought-provoking. As we conclude, I encourage each of you to stay engaged in this conversation, whether you're a policymaker, a business leader, or a citizen concerned about climate change. These are exciting and important years in the design of the new international architecture for carbon markets. And we need everyone participating and making sure that they're delivering our collective goals around climate change mitigation and resource mobilization around the globe. Thank you so much and have a great day.